In 1918, the guns of World War I finally fell silent. After 4 years of unimaginable carnage, after 10 million soldiers had fallen in muddy trenches from Belgium to the Ottoman Empire, the world exhaled. Cities erupted in celebration. Strangers embraced in the streets of London, Paris, and New York. Church bells rang across continents. Peace at last had come. But beneath the jubilation, something else was spreading. Something invisible. Something unstoppable. And it would kill more people in 18 months than the entire war had claimed in 4 years. This is the story of the Spanish flu, the deadliest pandemic in human history, a plague that infected one-third of the world's population, a virus that didn't discriminate between soldier and civilian, rich and poor, young and old, a catastrophe so immense that entire communities vanished. And yet, within a generation, the world had almost forgotten it ever happened. The year is 1918. The war is ending, but humanity's greatest battle has only just begun. Let's go back to the beginning of that year, January 1918. The world was exhausted. The Great War had been grinding on since 1914, consuming nations, economies, and entire generations. In the trenches of France, soldiers huddled in frozen mud, waiting for orders that might send them over the top into machine gun fire. On the home front, families rationed food, mourned their dead, and prayed for an end. But something peculiar was happening in the American Midwest. In Haskell County, Kansas, a rural farming community where winter winds swept across endless plains, a local doctor named Loring Miner began noticing unusual cases. Farmers were coming down with severe respiratory illness, high fevers, violent coughing, bodies racked with pain. It looked like influenza, but it was fiercer than any flu Dr. Miner had seen in his decades of practice. He treated them as best he could. Most recovered, some didn't. And then, just as mysteriously as it had appeared, the illness seemed to fade away. What Dr. Miner didn't know, what no one could have known, was that he had just witnessed the first spark of a global inferno. In March 1918, young men from Haskell County were drafted into the U.S. Army. They reported to Camp Funston, part of Fort Riley, Kansas, one of the largest military training facilities in America. Thousands of recruits lived in close quarters there, training for deployment to the battlefields of Europe. The conditions were perfect for contagion. Men slept in crowded barracks, ate in packed mess halls, and drilled shoulder to shoulder in the cold. On March 4th, a company cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the camp hospital complaining of fever, sore throat, and headache. Within hours, dozens more soldiers arrived with identical symptoms. By noon, over 100 men were sick. By week's end, 500. The camp medical officer was baffled. Influenza outbreaks weren't uncommon in military camps, but this was different. This was aggressive, this was fast, and it was spreading through the barracks like wildfire through dry grass. But America was at war. Troop deployments couldn't stop for a flu outbreak. Soldiers continued training, and in April, thousands of young American men boarded ships bound for France, carrying with them more than rifles and rations. They carried a virus. Let's pause here and understand what influenza actually is. The flu virus is ancient. It's plagued humanity for centuries, perhaps millennia. It's a respiratory infection caused by influenza viruses, organisms so small they're invisible to the naked eye, yet capable of bringing entire civilizations to their knees. What makes influenza particularly dangerous is its ability to mutate. The virus constantly changes its genetic structure, creating new strains that human immune systems don't recognize. It's why we need new flu vaccines every year. It's why influenza never truly goes away. In 1918, viruses weren't yet understood. Scientists knew that diseases could spread from person to person, but they hadn't yet identified the microscopic pathogens responsible. The electron microscope, the tool that would eventually allow us to see viruses, wouldn't be invented for another decade. Doctors in 1918 were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't identify, and didn't understand. And this particular strain of influenza was different. Most flu viruses kill the very young and the very old, those with weakened immune systems. But the 1918 flu had a horrifying quirk. It targeted healthy young adults, People in their 20s and 30s, people in the prime of their lives, people who should have been strong enough to fight it off. The virus triggered something called a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that turned the body's defenses against itself. The stronger your immune system, the more violently it reacted, filling the lungs with fluid, essentially drowning victims from within. Young, healthy people died faster than the elderly. No one in 1918 understood this. All they knew was that something was terribly, terribly wrong. By April 1918, American troops were arriving in France by the tens of thousands. They disembarked at ports like Brest and Saint-Nazaire, joining the exhausted British and French forces who had been fighting for years. The Americans brought fresh hope to the Allied cause. They also brought the virus. In the cramped military camps of France, where soldiers from different continents lived in close proximity, the flu found paradise. Men from Kansas mingled with men from New York, California, Texas. They ate together, slept in overcrowded barracks, and marched in formation. The virus leaped from person to person with ruthless efficiency. British military camps reported outbreaks, then French camps, then German camps on the other side of the trenches. The flu didn't recognize national boundaries or military allegiances. It infected everyone. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the flu got its misleading name. All the major powers fighting World War I, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, had something in common. They had censored their press. Wartime censorship meant that newspapers couldn't report anything that might damage morale or help the enemy. That included reports of disease outbreaks that might suggest weakness. So when soldiers started falling ill by the thousands in France and Britain and Germany, the newspapers said nothing. The government said nothing. Military hospitals filled up, and the civilian world remained largely ignorant. But there was one major European country that wasn't involved in the war: Spain. Spain was neutral in World War I. It had no wartime censorship. So when the flu reached Spain in May 1918, Spanish newspapers reported freely on the illness, spreading through Madrid. King Alfonso III himself fell ill. The papers covered it extensively. The rest of the world, reading Spanish press reports because their own newspapers were censored, began calling it the Spanish flu. The name stuck. For over a century, this pandemic has been called the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with its origin. Spain didn't create the flu. Spain simply told the truth about it, and for that honesty, they received the blame. Let's follow the virus as it began its global journey in the spring of 1918. From the military camps of France, soldiers on leave carried it to Paris. From Paris, it spread to London. From London to Glasgow and Liverpool. Merchant ships departing European ports carried it across the Atlantic, to South America, to Africa, to Asia. In May, the flu appeared in China. In June, it reached India. By July, it had arrived in Australia. Islands in the Pacific that had never seen influenza before suddenly found their populations bedridden with fever. But here's the strange thing. This first wave, what epidemiologists now call the spring wave, was relatively mild. People got sick. Some died, but most recovered after a week or two of misery. Compared to what was coming, this was a gentle warning shot. Military doctors noted the illness but didn't panic. Influenza was common. Soldiers had survived worse. By summer, infection rates were dropping. The outbreak seemed to be fading. Perhaps it had been just another flu season after all. In the trenches of France, the war continued. On June 6th, American forces helped stop a German offensive at Château-Thierry. In July, Allied forces launched counterattacks. By August, the tide was clearly turning. The Germans were retreating. Victory felt close. But the virus wasn't finished yet. It was only evolving. Somewhere during that summer of 1918, the influenza virus mutated. Perhaps it happened in the crowded conditions of a military camp. Perhaps in a hospital. Perhaps in the body of a single infected person whose immune system pushed the virus to adapt in order to survive. We don't know exactly where or when it happened. But by late August, a new strain of the flu had emerged. And this one was a killer. The second wave began almost simultaneously in 3 distant locations. In late August, sailors at a naval facility in Boston began falling ill. Around the same time, soldiers in a military camp in Sierra Leone, West Africa, reported severe cases, and French troops near Brest experienced a sudden spike in respiratory illness. Within days, it became clear that this was not the same flu that had circulated in the spring. This was something far worse. Soldiers who came down with this new strain didn't just experience fever and cough. They hemorrhaged. Blood poured from their noses. They coughed up blood. Their skin turned dark blue from lack of oxygen, a condition called cyanosis that indicated their lungs were failing. Doctors were horrified. Some victims died within hours of showing their first symptoms. Young soldiers who had been healthy and strong in the morning were dead by evening. Autopsies revealed lungs that were completely destroyed, filled with bloody fluid, as if the men had drowned on dry land. One Army physician described the scene at Camp Devens in Massachusetts in September 1918. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. That letter, written by a doctor to a colleague, captures the sheer terror of those early days of the second wave. Doctors were watching people die in ways they'd never seen before, and they had no idea how to stop it. From military camps, the virus spread into civilian populations. Boston was hit hard first. By mid-September, the city's hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock. Medical students were pulled from classes to help. Still, there weren't enough hands. The disease didn't behave like normal flu. It struck with terrifying speed. A person could feel fine in the morning, develop symptoms by noon, and be dead by midnight. Families went to bed healthy and woke to find loved ones dead in their sleep. Cities across America watched Boston with growing dread, knowing that whatever was happening there would soon arrive at their doorstep. And they were right. Philadelphia would become one of the deadliest examples of what happens when a city ignores a pandemic. In September 1918, Philadelphia's public health director, Wilmer Cruson, was aware of the flu outbreak spreading through military camps in Boston. Health officials urged him to cancel large public gatherings, but Philadelphia had plans, big plans. The city was preparing for a massive parade on September 28th to support the war effort. It was supposed to be the largest parade in Philadelphia's history. 200,000 people were expected to line Broad Street. Marching bands, Boy Scouts, military units, thousands of participants. It would be a spectacular show of patriotism. Cruson decided the parade would go on. After all, the war was almost won. Morale was important. And how bad could the flu really be? On September 28, 1918, more than 200,000 people gathered shoulder to shoulder along the parade route. They cheered. They celebrated. They stood in close contact for hours. 72 hours later, Philadelphia's hospitals were in crisis. Every bed was full. Doctors and nurses were falling ill. Within a week, more than 4,500 Philadelphians were dead. Within 6 weeks, more than 12,000. That parade, that single decision to ignore the warnings, turned Philadelphia into one of the deadliest cities in America during the pandemic. It remains one of the most tragic examples in public health history of the cost of denial. But the virus wasn't just spreading through America, it was spreading everywhere. In September, the flu returned to Europe with a vengeance. London, Paris, Berlin, cities already exhausted by 4 years of war, now faced a new catastrophe. Hospitals that had been treating wounded soldiers now overflowed with flu victims. In Britain, schools closed. Theaters shut down. Public gatherings were banned. London's famed double-decker buses stood empty because too many drivers and conductors were sick. Coal mines closed because miners couldn't work. Factories producing war materials slowed to a crawl. In France, entire villages disappeared. Rural communities with no doctors, no hospitals, and no resources were decimated. In some places, so many people died so quickly that there was no one left to bury the dead. Even the German army, retreating across France after their failed summer offensives, was hit hard. Thousands of German soldiers fell ill. Some historians argue that the flu contributed to Germany's final collapse. How can an army fight when half its soldiers can barely stand? The Spanish flu was the first truly global pandemic in the age of modern transportation. Steamships could cross oceans in days. Trains could transport infected passengers across continents. Soldiers and merchants and refugees moved constantly, carrying the virus with them wherever they went. The flu reached places that had never experienced pandemic disease before. In India, the pandemic was catastrophic. India was still under British colonial rule, and millions of Indians lived in densely packed cities with poor sanitation. The flu swept through Bombay, Calcutta, and Delhi like a monsoon. Rural villages were devastated. Estimates vary, but most historians believe that between 12 and 20 million Indians died of Spanish flu, representing perhaps 5% of the entire Indian population. Imagine that. 1 in 20 people, gone. Bodies piled up faster than they could be cremated or buried. The Ganges River, sacred to Hindus, became clogged with corpses. Entire families died in their homes, and days would pass before anyone noticed. British colonial authorities, already stretched thin by the war, were unable to provide adequate relief. Medical supplies were scarce, doctors were few, and many Indians, already suffering under colonial exploitation and a series of poor harvests, were too weak and malnourished to fight off the infection. One British civil servant in India wrote, "The mortality is so great that the living have barely time to bury the dead. The whole social fabric is crumbling." Africa suffered similarly. In Sierra Leone, where the second wave had first appeared in late August, entire coastal communities were wiped out. The flu spread inland, following trade routes and rivers deep into the continent. In South Africa, the virus arrived on a troop ship carrying soldiers returning from Europe. The ship was refused permission to dock, but it was too late. Infected passengers had already come ashore during an earlier stop. Within weeks, South Africa was experiencing one of the worst outbreaks in the world. South African cities quarantined neighborhoods. Black South Africans, already living under the oppression of early apartheid-like systems, had the least access to medical care and suffered the highest death rates. In some mining compounds where black workers lived in crowded dormitories, mortality rates exceeded 10%. An estimated 300,000 South Africans died in a matter of months, about 6% of the country's total population. The flu reached the Pacific Islands with devastating consequences. Remote islands in Samoa, Fiji, and Tonga had been largely protected from epidemic diseases for centuries by their isolation. Their populations had never been exposed to influenza and had no immunity. When ships brought the virus to their shores in late 1918, the results were apocalyptic. In Western Samoa, which was under New Zealand administration, a ship carrying infected passengers arrived in November. The New Zealand governor refused to implement quarantine measures. Within weeks, 22% of the population was dead. 22%. Nearly 1 in 4 Samoans died in a matter of weeks. Entire families perished. Villages lost all their elders, all their leaders. Children were left orphaned by the hundreds. The social fabric of Samoan society was torn apart. In Fiji, the British colonial governor did implement quarantine, but it was only partially successful. Around 9,000 Fijians died, about 5% of the population. The Pacific Islands would not forget this catastrophe. For generations, the Spanish flu remained seared into cultural memory, a trauma passed down through stories and songs. In the United States, the flu hit Native American communities with horrific force. Native Americans, living on reservations with limited access to health care, inadequate housing, and high rates of poverty and malnutrition, were extremely vulnerable. Entire tribes lost significant portions of their populations. In Alaska, native villages were devastated. In some communities, 80% of the population died. Entire villages were found abandoned, everyone dead, bodies frozen in the Arctic cold. The flu reached places so remote that help couldn't arrive in time. One Inuit survivor later recalled, "We woke one morning and found almost everyone dead. There was no one to help us bury them. The dogs were howling. We just left." Native American reservations in the lower 48 states face similar horrors. The Cherokee, Sioux, Navajo, all suffered disproportionate losses. Federal government support was minimal to non-existent. Reservation hospitals, where they existed at all, were overwhelmed within days. The Spanish flu struck hardest at communities that were already marginalized, already struggling. It exposed and deepened existing inequalities. And it reminded the world, though the world rarely listened, that pandemics don't affect everyone equally. Let's travel to South America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. The flu arrived in the autumn of 1918 and spread rapidly through port cities. In Rio de Janeiro, the carnival atmosphere of one of the world's most vibrant cities ground to a halt. Streetcars ran empty, shops closed, the famous beaches were deserted, mass graves were dug on the outskirts of the city. In Chile, the flu reached remote mining communities in the Andes Mountains. Men who spent their lives digging copper and nitrates from the earth now died gasping for air in high-altitude camps. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the barren hills. Argentina, with its large immigrant population from Europe, saw the virus spread quickly through Buenos Aires. Italian and Spanish immigrants living in crowded tenement buildings were particularly hard hit. The government struggled to respond. Hospitals overflowed. Pharmacies ran out of even basic medicines. Across South America, the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. But because many rural deaths went unreported, we'll never know the true number. The virus even reached the Arctic. In November 1918, the flu came to Nome, Alaska, and from there spread to isolated Inuit communities scattered across the frozen north. Entire villages were wiped out. In some cases, only a handful of survivors remained. Dogs howled outside homes where everyone inside had died. Children wandered between houses looking for any adult still alive. The cold preserved bodies until spring, when burial parties could finally dig graves in the frozen ground. One rescue team, arriving at a remote village months after the outbreak, found everyone dead except for two small children who had survived by eating frozen fish they found stored in a hut. The children couldn't speak. Trauma and cold and hunger had stolen their words. These are the stories history often forgets. The remote tragedies, the communities too small to make headlines. But every single one of those deaths was someone's loved one, someone's child or parent or friend. If you're still here, it means you love exploring the hidden chapters of history. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button. More untold stories are waiting. By October 1918, the pandemic was at its peak. Across the globe, hundreds of thousands of people were dying every week. Cities became ghost towns. In Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Americans lived in fear. Many people wore masks for the first time in their lives. Gauze masks, often homemade, became mandatory in many cities. Officials promised they would help. In truth, the masks of 1918 were too porous to stop a virus, but they gave people something to do, some sense of control in a situation that felt utterly uncontrollable. Police officers wore masks. Mailmen wore masks. Shop clerks wore masks. Public service announcements urged people to cover their coughs. Spitting on sidewalks, a common habit at the time, was banned in many cities. Seattle made mask-wearing mandatory under penalty of fine or arrest. Photographs from October 1918 show Seattle streetcars full of masked passengers, looking like something from a dystopian future, or perhaps, from our perspective now, in 2025, looking uncomfortably familiar. But masks alone couldn't stop the spread. The virus was too contagious, too virulent, and people still needed to work, shop, and eat. Healthcare systems collapsed under the strain. There weren't enough doctors. There weren't enough nurses. There weren't enough hospital beds. Medical personnel themselves were falling ill and dying. Some hospitals lost a quarter of their staff. Nursing schools graduated students early. Medical students were pulled from classes to treat patients. Volunteers with no medical training were pressed into service to help care for the sick and dying. Emergency hospitals were set up in schools, churches, and public buildings. In Philadelphia, entire city blocks were converted into makeshift wards. Cots lined gymnasium floors. Patients lay shoulder to shoulder, sometimes with barely enough room for nurses to walk between them. And still, there weren't enough beds. Families cared for their sick at home because hospitals had no room. But this meant the virus spread more easily within households. A father would bring it home from work. The mother would fall ill nursing him. The children would catch it from both parents. Entire families died together in their homes, with no one knowing until neighbors noticed the silence. The death toll was staggering. In the United States, October 1918 was the deadliest month. More than 190,000 Americans died that month alone. To put that in perspective, more Americans died of the Spanish flu in October 1918 than died in combat during all of World War I. Undertakers couldn't keep up. Coffin makers worked around the clock and still couldn't produce enough caskets. In some cities, bodies were buried in mass graves, often without proper identification. Families searching for missing loved ones might never know where they were buried. Philadelphia ran out of coffins. Bodies piled up in homes, in morgues, and warehouses. The city government eventually commandeered every truck and wagon available to collect corpses. Burial details worked day and night. One Philadelphia undertaker described the scene. "I have 75 bodies in my morgue. I can't handle any more. People are dying in their homes because there's no room in the hospitals. The bodies stay there, sometimes for days before we can collect them. The smell is everywhere." New York City dug mass graves in Hart Island, where the city still buries its unclaimed dead today. Thousands of flu victims were interred there, their identities sometimes unknown, their families sometimes dead themselves. Let's talk about what it was like to be sick with the Spanish flu. It began suddenly: a headache, a sore throat. Within hours, a raging fever would develop. Muscles ached as if they'd been beaten. Joints swelled. The cough started, dry, painful, relentless. In mild cases, victims recovered after a week of misery. But in severe cases, things deteriorated rapidly. The skin took on a dusky blue color as oxygen levels dropped. Patients gasped for air, each breath a struggle. Blood vessels in the lungs burst, causing hemorrhaging. Victims coughed up blood, sometimes so much blood that they choked on it. Pneumonia set in as secondary bacterial infections attacked lungs weakened by the virus. Without antibiotics, in which wouldn't be discovered for another decade, these infections were often fatal. Delirium was common. Patients raved in fever dreams, seeing things that weren't there, calling out for people long dead. Hospital wards were filled with the sounds of coughing, moaning, and the desperate gasps of people drowning in their own fluids. Doctors could do almost nothing. They had no antiviral medications. They didn't understand what caused influenza. They tried everything: aspirin to reduce fever, oxygen to help breathing, bloodletting in some cases because that's what medicine had done for centuries. Nothing worked reliably. Doctors watched helplessly as young, healthy patients died in front of them. One nurse in Boston wrote in her diary, "I have never seen anything like this. Strong men in the morning, dead by evening. We can't save them. We can't even comfort them properly because we're so overwhelmed. I go home at night and cry. Then I wake up and do it again." But the virus wasn't finished yet. It was about to show the world just how cruel it could be. In November 1918, as the war finally ended, as people poured into the streets to celebrate armistice and peace, the virus claimed some of its most heartbreaking victims. Pregnant women who contracted the flu faced a terrifying choice. If they survived, which many didn't, the mortality rate for pregnant women with Spanish flu was extraordinarily high. Some studies suggest up to 50% of pregnant women who caught the virus died. Those who survived often lost their babies. Young children, usually resilient against flu, died in alarming numbers. Orphanages overflowed with children who had lost parents. Some children lost both parents and all their siblings, becoming the sole survivors of their families. There are accounts of children as young as 5 or 6 years old found wandering the streets, crying for parents who would never come home. Charitable organizations struggled to care for the sudden influx of orphans. In rural areas, entire families died with no one to discover them for days or weeks. Mail carriers and neighbors would eventually notice the silence and find whole households dead. One account from rural Montana describes a family of 7, parents, 4 children, and a grandmother, all found dead in their farmhouse. The last to die had been one of the children, perhaps 10 years old, who had apparently tried to care for the others before succumbing herself. A half-written note was found beside her body. Mom and Papa are dead. Baby sister too. I tried. I'm so tired. Stories like these played out across the world, in every language, in every culture. The virus didn't discriminate. It killed without mercy. By December 1918, the second wave was finally subsiding. Infection rates dropped. Deaths declined. The virus hadn't been defeated. It had simply burned through most of the susceptible population. Survivors now had immunity. The virus had fewer victims left to claim. But there would be one more wave. In early 1919, a milder third wave swept through various parts of the world. It killed far fewer people than the catastrophic second wave, but it was a grim reminder that the virus wasn't gone, just dormant. By the spring of 1919, the pandemic was effectively over. The virus had mutated into less lethal strains. Populations had developed immunity. The Spanish flu joined the ranks of seasonal influenza, no longer the killer it had been, but the damage was done. Let's look at the numbers. Though numbers can never fully capture the human tragedy, estimates vary because record-keeping in 1918 was incomplete, especially in rural areas and colonized regions. But most historians and epidemiologists now believe that the Spanish flu infected approximately 500 million people worldwide, about one-third of the entire global population. The death toll was somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. The most commonly cited figure is around 50 million, though some researchers argue it could have been as high as 100 million. To put that in perspective, World War I killed approximately 20 million people over 4 years. The Spanish flu killed at least twice that many in 18 months. It was and remains the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. In the United States, about 675,000 Americans died, more than all American military deaths in World Wars I and II combined. Life expectancy in the United States dropped by 12 years between 1917 and 1918, almost entirely due to the flu. India lost between 12 and 20 million people. Europe lost between 2 and 3 million. Asia, Africa, South America, every continent except Antarctica was affected. Some islands in the Pacific lost more than 20% of their populations. Indigenous communities worldwide suffered disproportionately. Some Native American tribes lost entire generations of elders, taking with them irreplaceable cultural knowledge, languages, and traditions. But here's perhaps the most disturbing part of this story. The world forgot. Within a decade, the Spanish flu had largely faded from public memory. It wasn't taught in schools. Historians barely mentioned it. Unlike World War I, which was commemorated with memorials and ceremonies and countless books, the Spanish flu left barely a mark on collective memory. Why? There are several theories. First, it happened at the same time as the end of World War I. The war dominated headlines. The pandemic was often seen as just another aspect of the war's chaos. When people reminisced about 1918, they remembered the armistice, not the pandemic. Second, it was traumatic in a way that people wanted to forget. War, as terrible as it is, has narratives of heroism and sacrifice. A pandemic just has death. Random, senseless, unstoppable death. There's no enemy to hate, no victory to celebrate. People wanted to move on. Third, medicine's failure to stop the pandemic was embarrassing. By 1918, modern medicine had made great strides. Doctors could perform surgery, set bones, prescribe medications. But against the flu, they were helpless. The medical establishment had little interest in dwelling on its greatest failure. And finally, the 1920s roared. After the trauma of war and pandemic, people wanted to live. The decade became famous for its parties, its jazz, its sense of liberation. Looking back at the death and despair of 1918 didn't fit the mood. So the Spanish flu was forgotten. It became a footnote. Libraries and archives hold thousands of documents about World War I for every single document about the pandemic, even though the pandemic killed more people. But the virus itself didn't completely disappear. Scientists now believe that all subsequent influenza A strains, all seasonal flu, descends from that 1918 virus. It didn't go extinct, it just became less deadly as human populations developed immunity and the virus evolved to keep its hosts alive longer, which is better for spreading. In the 1950s, scientists began trying to understand what made the 1918 flu so deadly. In 1951, a researcher named Johann Holton traveled to Alaska to search for tissue samples from flu victims buried in permafrost. He successfully recovered samples, but the technology to analyze them didn't exist yet. In 1997, Holton returned to Alaska, now 72 years old. With permission from native village elders, he exhumed bodies from a mass grave and extracted lung tissue samples. This time, scientists had the tools to sequence the virus's genetic code. In 2005, researchers successfully reconstructed the 1918 virus from genetic material. They discovered that it was an H1N1 strain that likely jumped directly from birds to humans, something that rarely happens. The virus had adapted to infect humans with unprecedented efficiency. This research has proven invaluable in preparing for future pandemics. The lessons learned from studying the 1918 virus helped guide responses to subsequent outbreaks like the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the SARS outbreak, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. The Spanish flu taught the world, or should have taught the world, several crucial lessons. First, pandemics are always possible. Viruses evolve, new diseases emerge. No amount of medical advancement makes us invulnerable. Second, denial kills. Philadelphia's parade, the governments that censored pandemic news, the officials who minimized the danger, all of them contributed to more deaths. Honesty and quick action save lives. Third, society's most vulnerable always suffer the most. In 1918, it was the poor, colonized peoples, indigenous communities, and those without access to health care who died in the highest numbers. Inequality doesn't just mean some people have less money. It means some people die while others survive. Fourth, we must maintain medical infrastructure. The healthcare systems in 1918 collapsed because there weren't enough doctors, nurses, or hospitals. That lesson should have ensured every country built robust healthcare systems. Many didn't. Fifth, public health measures work. Cities that implemented social distancing, closed schools and theaters, and enforced mask mandates saw lower death rates than cities that didn't. It wasn't perfect, but it made a difference. And finally, we will forget. Humans are remarkable at moving on from trauma. It's a survival mechanism. But it also means we forget the lessons learned at terrible cost. For decades, people who survived the Spanish flu rarely talked about it. It was too painful. Families had been destroyed. Friends had disappeared. The trauma was too deep. But in the 1970s and 1980s, historians began interviewing the few remaining survivors. These oral histories captured what documents couldn't: the human experience of living through the pandemic. A woman in her 90s interviewed in 1982 remembered being 8 years old in 1918. My mother got sick first, then my father, then my baby brother. I was the oldest, so I tried to take care of them. I didn't know what to do. I was just a child. My brother died first. He was only 2. Mama died next. Papa lasted another week. I was alone in the house with their bodies for 3 days before someone checked on us. I've never forgotten that silence. Another survivor, a man who had been a young soldier in 1918, recalled, "The war was hell. We all knew that, but we thought coming home would be safe. Then half the guys in my unit died of the flu before they could even get discharged. Some of them never saw their families again. They survived the trenches just to die in an army hospital from a disease none of us understood." These testimonies remind us that behind every statistic, every number in the death toll, was a person. Someone who laughed and cried and hoped and feared. Someone who mattered. Today in 2025, we have tools the people of 1918 couldn't have dreamed of. We have vaccines. We understand viruses. We have ventilators, antiviral medications, antibiotics for secondary infections. We have global health organizations that can track disease outbreaks in real time. We have the ability to sequence a virus's genome in days instead of decades. And yet, despite all our advances, we're not invincible. The COVID-19 pandemic proved that. When that novel coronavirus emerged in late 2019, it spread across the world with frightening speed, just as the Spanish flu had done a century earlier. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Healthcare workers were exhausted. People wore masks and social distance. Governments debated lockdowns and restrictions. Misinformation spread as fast as the virus. History was repeating itself. The parallels between 1918 and 2020 were impossible to ignore. The same debates about personal freedom versus public health. The same political tensions when some leaders downplayed the threat while others acted decisively. The same disparity in outcomes with marginalized communities suffering the highest death tolls. The same exhaustion of healthcare workers pushed beyond their limits. But there were differences too. In 1918, people didn't know what a virus was. In 2020, we did. In 1918, developing a vaccine would have been impossible. In 2020, vaccines were developed in record time. In 1918, communication traveled at the speed of telegrams and newspapers. In 2020, information and misinformation spread instantly across the internet. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded the world that the Spanish flu wasn't just ancient history. It was a preview of what could happen again. And it will happen again. Someday another virus will emerge with pandemic potential. The only question is whether we'll be ready. Let me tell you about one more person. Her name was Vera Brittain, a British nurse and writer who served in military hospitals during World War I. She survived the war, survived the Spanish flu, and lived until 1970. In her memoir, Testament of Youth, she wrote about the strange duality of 1918. We had endured 4 years of war, believing that peace would make everything right again. But peace came with a plague. I nursed soldiers whose wounds were healing, only to watch them die of flu in the same bed where they'd survived bullets and shrapnel. The war ended, but the dying didn't. Armistice Day should have been the happiest day of our lives. Instead, hospitals were so full of flu patients that we could barely celebrate. The silence after the guns stopped wasn't peaceful. It was haunted. Vera Brittain understood something crucial. The Spanish flu wasn't a separate tragedy from World War I. They were intertwined. The war created perfect conditions for the pandemic. Millions of soldiers living in close quarters, traveling across oceans, returning home to crowded cities. The war weakened populations through years of rationing and stress. The war censored news that might have saved lives, and the pandemic changed the war's ending. Germany's army was crippled by flu in the fall of 1918. Some historians argue that the pandemic hastened the armistice. Soldiers on both sides were too sick to fight. The war didn't end with a decisive military victory as much as it ended with exhaustion. Exhaustion from combat and exhaustion from disease. Walk through any old cemetery today, and you might notice something. Clusters of gravestones dated 1918, often entire families buried within days or weeks of each other. Many of the stones are weathered now, the names barely legible. But they're there, silent witnesses to a catastrophe the world chose to forget. In Alaska, descendants of flu victims still visit mass graves on hillsides overlooking the sea. In India, villages hold remembrance ceremonies for ancestors lost to the Great Dying. In Samoa, the memory of 1918 is still taught to children, a reminder of what can happen when disease strikes an unprepared population. These communities didn't forget. For them, the Spanish flu isn't history. It's family history. It's great-grandparents they never met. It's languages that disappeared when the last elder died. It's songs no one sings anymore because everyone who knew them is gone. The Spanish flu changed the world in ways we don't always recognize. It influenced medicine. The pandemic's failure drove researchers to better understand respiratory diseases. It led to improvements in public health infrastructure in many countries. It motivated the development of the first primitive mechanical ventilators. It sparked interest in virology that would eventually lead to the discovery and isolation of the influenza virus in 1933. It influenced culture, though subtly. The lost generation of writers in the 1920s, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and others, were shaped by the twin traumas of war and pandemic. Themes of meaninglessness, of death's randomness, of lost innocence pervade their work. They wrote about a world that had seen too much, survived too much. It influenced demographics. The death of so many young adults created a generation gap. Children who lost parents in 1918 grew up in orphanages or with relatives. Some of these orphan children would become the soldiers of World War II, carrying their own trauma into another conflict. It influenced politics. Governments that had failed their people during the pandemic faced angry voters. The Spanish flu didn't cause any revolutions by itself, but it contributed to the social unrest that swept through many countries in the early 1920s. And it created a collective trauma that, even though largely unspoken, shaped an entire generation's worldview. People who survived 1918 knew viscerally that the world could end. Not metaphorically, but literally. Everyone you know could be dead within weeks. Today, researchers continue studying the 1918 flu. They excavate burial sites in remote locations where permafrost has preserved tissue samples. They analyze historical records, looking for patterns that might predict future pandemics. They use computer models to simulate how a 1918-like virus would spread in today's interconnected world. The answers are sobering. Despite all our medical advances, a virus as virulent as the 1918 flu would still be catastrophic. Air travel would spread it faster. Urban density would amplify transmission. We'd have vaccines eventually, but not fast enough to prevent millions of deaths. This isn't meant to be alarmist. It's meant to be realistic. The Spanish flu taught us that pandemics are not ancient history. They're not something that only happened in the past. They're a recurring threat that humanity must always be prepared to face. There's a cemetery outside Philadelphia where more than 500 flu victims from October 1918 are buried in a mass grave. For decades, the grave was unmarked. In 2018, on the centennial of the pandemic, the city finally erected a memorial. The memorial is simple, a granite stone with the dates in a single line. They were not forgotten, but they were forgotten. For 100 years, they were forgotten. The memorial is an acknowledgement of that failure, as much as it is a tribute. Across the world, similar memorials have begun appearing. Small plaques in hospitals, markers in cemeteries, museum exhibits. A century later, the world is finally remembering. Why now? Perhaps because those who survived the Spanish flu are all gone. The last survivors died in the early 2000s. Now that there's no one left to feel the pain of remembering, we can finally acknowledge what happened. Or perhaps it's because we've seen it happen again. The COVID-19 pandemic made the Spanish flu relevant in a way it hadn't been for decades. Suddenly, the old stories didn't seem so distant. The black and white photographs of masked faces could have been taken yesterday. We understand now what they felt then. The fear, the uncertainty, the grief, the exhaustion, the strange sensation of living through history while just trying to survive another day. Let me tell you one final story. In a small town in Nebraska, there's a letter preserved in a local historical society. It was written in November 1918 by a woman named Margaret to her sister, who lived in another state. Margaret never sent the letter. It was found in her Bible after she died in 1962. The letter reads, "Dear Sarah, by the time you receive this, if you receive it at all, I may be gone. The flu has taken everyone. John died Tuesday. The baby died Thursday. Mother lasted until Friday morning. I am alone in this house with their bodies, and I can feel the fever starting in me too. I'm not writing to make you sad. I'm writing because I need someone to know we were here. We lived. We loved each other. We mattered. This disease has stolen so much, but it can't steal that. If I die, know that my last thoughts were of you and of the summers we spent as girls, running through the wheat fields behind Papa's farm. Remember me there, in the sunshine, laughing. Tell your children about us. Don't let us disappear. All my love, Margaret." Margaret survived. She recovered from the flu and lived another 44 years, but she never sent the letter. Perhaps it was too painful a reminder. Perhaps she couldn't find words to explain what she'd endured. So she kept it, hidden in her Bible, a private testimony to the worst days of her life. That letter now sits in a climate-controlled archive in Nebraska. And because of it, we know Margaret's name. We know John, the baby, and mother. They are not forgotten. The Spanish flu infected 500 million people and killed at least 50 million. Behind each of those numbers was a person, a Margaret, a John, a baby without a name in the historical record. They died in their homes, in hospitals, in military camps, in villages across 6 continents. They died gasping for breath. They died holding loved ones' hands. They died alone. They died confused, wondering why this was happening. They died angry. They died resigned. They died too soon, and the world moved on. Because that's what humans do. We survive. We rebuild. We have children who don't remember what we endured. We tell ourselves it won't happen again, even though we know it will. The Spanish flu was the deadliest pandemic in human history, but it won't be the last pandemic. Viruses evolve. Diseases emerge. The world is more connected now than in 1918, which means the next pandemic could spread even faster. We have better medicine, better communication, better understanding. But we also have more people living closer together, traveling further. We have climate change, disrupting ecosystems, and bringing humans into contact with new pathogens. We have misinformation spreading faster than any virus. The question isn't whether another pandemic will happen. The question is whether we'll remember the lessons of 1918 when it does. History isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. It's what we learn. It's what we pass down to the next generation. For too long, we chose not to remember the Spanish flu. We chose to forget the 50 million dead, the orphaned children, the exhausted nurses, the helpless doctors, the mass graves, the silence that fell over cities, the families that vanished. But forgetting doesn't prevent recurrence. It guarantees it. The Spanish flu survivors, those who lived through the nightmare of 1918, most of them never spoke about it. They carried the trauma silently until they died. And when they died, their stories died with them. We can't bring them back. We can't undo what happened. But we can remember. We can tell their stories. We can learn from their suffering. We can honor their memory by being better prepared for the next pandemic. By building stronger healthcare systems. By listening to scientists. By responding quickly when outbreaks begin. By protecting the most vulnerable among us. That's not just history. That's responsibility. In 1918, a virus spread around the world, killing without mercy. It infected rich and poor, young and old, soldiers and civilians. It reached every continent. It devastated communities and destroyed families. It killed more people in 18 months than the Great War killed in 4 years. And then it faded into history, becoming a footnote that most people never learned about. But the dead deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered. Their names may be lost, their graves unmarked, their stories untold, but they were here, they lived, they mattered. The Spanish flu was not just a medical catastrophe, it was a human tragedy on an almost incomprehensible scale. It was mothers dying while their children cried. It was doctors working until they collapsed. It was villages disappearing. It was teenagers burying their parents. It was the world holding its breath, wondering if humanity would survive. We did survive, but at a terrible cost. And now, more than a century later, we're finally beginning to remember. We're finally telling the story. We're finally acknowledging that this happened, that it was real, that it was devastating, and that it could happen again. The Spanish flu of 1918 was the deadliest pandemic in human history, but it doesn't have to be a forgotten pandemic. This is their story. These are their voices echoing across a century. These are the lessons they paid for with their lives. The guns of World War I fell silent in November 1918. The dying from the Spanish flu continued for months afterward, quieter than the war, but just as deadly. By the time it was over, the world had changed. It had lost millions of people. It had learned that invisible threats could be more dangerous than any army. It had discovered that medicine had limits, that governments could fail, that death could come swiftly and without warning. And then, remarkably, the world forgot. But we're remembering now, in museums and memorials, in research papers and documentaries, in conversations like this one. We're remembering because we must. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we remember. And what we remember shapes who we become. The Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people. That's 50 million stories that ended too soon. 50 million futures that never happened. 50 million absences that shaped the century that followed. They were not forgotten. Not anymore. History isn't just what happened. It's what we remember. It's the stories we choose to keep alive. It's the lessons we refuse to let fade into silence. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed more people than any pandemic in recorded history. It devastated families, destroyed communities, and changed the course of civilization. And for a century, most of the world barely remembered it happened. But now you know. You know about Margaret and John and the baby. You know about the nurses who worked until they collapsed. You know about the villages that disappeared, the orphaned children, the mass graves, the silence that fell over cities. You know about the 50 million who died. And knowing means it matters. Knowing means they're not forgotten. Knowing means we can learn from their suffering and maybe, just maybe, do better next time. Because there will be a next time. The only question is whether we'll be ready. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you learned something you didn't know, if you believe these voices from history deserve to be heard, then like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories the world almost forgot. Because history isn't just the past. History is a warning. History is a guide. History is a memorial to those who came before us, and their stories deserve to be told.